Audio check. Okay, good afternoon. Let's resume. Straight over to you, Mr. Humphreys, for your next witness.
Thank you, sir. I'll introduce Mr. Ferber. So is your name Neil Ferber?
Yeah, Neil Robert Ferber.
And you have one proof of evidence, which is a rebuttal landscape proof of evidence, and it's a rebuttal specifically to the proof of evidence of Christine Tudor. Just to set out very briefly your backgrounds, you set out your qualifications and experience at section 1.1 of your proof of evidence. You're a chartered member of the Landscape Institute. You have a BSc in Landscape Design and Plant Science and a postgraduate diploma in Landscape Architecture, and you're employed as an associate director with Wood UK Limited. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Ferber, you tell us in that section that you joined Wood in December 2020, so clearly you're not the author of the environmental statement. Can you just briefly explain why the author is not a witness?
Yeah, my ex-colleague who authored the environmental statement chapter is now retired. So there was a brief overlap between when I joined and when he left. That's why I'm picking it.
But have you familiarized yourself with the environmental statement?
I have indeed, yes.
And are you content to represent and support the views expressed in that document?
I am indeed.
And you also have been an author of two other documents before the inquiry, Appendix A to Mr. Melling's proof of evidence and also Appendix A to his rebuttal, and we don't need to touch on those today. I'm just going to get you, please, to go through the various documents that were prepared by the airport as part of the application, and as part of that, in Ms. Tudor's evidence, there was some criticism of the study area, and can we just look at that, look at the size of the study area and what the environmental statement was looking at. So we probably need to look at CD 2.5.23, and then perhaps we can look at some of the other documents. So get the 2.5.23. And within that, let's look at PDF page 4. I think is as good a place as any. If you want to take me to a different plan.
No, I think that's figure 9.1.
Figure 9.1?
LVI study area.
Yes, that's actually a better one, isn't it? Because
yes,
it shows the A and B boundary. So if we look at PDF page 1, figure 9.1, can you just, we have the red line application boundary, we have the 5 kilometre buffer and then a 10 kilometre buffer, which we can see is not a complete concentric circle around the airport, and we can see the Mendip Hills AO and B. Just please talk us through why the study area looks like that.
Yeah, normally they are concentric as an offset from an application boundary to varying distances, obviously depending on the type of development. but it was extended specifically to the south to cover the AONB, so that's why it was extended to 10 kilometres in that location.
And there was a brief discussion earlier about direct effects and indirect effects. Can you just explain your position on that and how that has influenced the study area?
Yes, I mean, I think the first starting point when you sort of define effects and the scope of the assessment is to refer to a ZTV, and that's what we did at figure 9.5. And you can see on figure 9.5 the location of the 5 kilometre buffer and the fact that most of the intervisibility of development on the airport site is largely in excess of 5 kilometres, and also on figure 9.5 we have the various viewpoint locations that are within the AONB, which include viewpoints 18, 16, 17, 15 and 19. And most of those viewpoints were included at the request of the scoping opinion that came back. So we'd included additional viewpoints within the AONB. The colour coding just relates to whether they were taken in the day or whether they were day and night photos. But what you'd need to do is sort of look at the two plans sort of in conjunction with each other, because although the AONB extends towards the site at a closer point, that area is outside the AONB, and that's in the vicinity of Buckham. So your kind of impact in terms of views from the AONB are predominantly sort of confined to distances beyond the 5 kilometre separation distance.
And if we have open CD5, 2.5.21 as well, which is the main text in Chapter 9 of the environmental statement, so that's CD 2.5.21, and turning that to PDF page 5, or 4 and 5, you can see there paragraph 9.4.1 and then 9.4.2. The 5 kilometre study area being extended to 10 kilometres is explained there, and in doing that, in extending the study area, was specific regard had to the AONB management plan?
Yes, it is, and I think that the high sensitivity of the AONB to development beyond its boundaries and within its setting is reflected in the fact that we have undertaken a detailed assessment against the special qualities of the AONB.
And then if we, to help the inspectors to understand the extent of the documentation that went into the assessment that was ultimately presented to the council, can you just identify for the inspectors, just by the CD numbers and the titles,
Yes.
the principal documents? We'll dip into some of them, we've already dipped into some of them, but just identify those so that they know the extent of the work.
So I think the first document is to look at the appendices, so that's CD 2.5.22.
So we've already looked at CD 5.21, which is the main text, and then 2.5.22 is a series of appendices, and then
Yeah.
with that go figures in two parts, CD 2.5.23 and 2.5.24, and CD 2.5.24 I think is largely montages
Yes.
and things of that sort. Was the scope of the environmental statement agreed with officers?
Yes, it was, and the number of viewpoints increased it doubled in number from 10 to 20 to account for their requests for additional viewpoints.
And then we know there were various further requests for information regulation 25, requests that we have in a number of documents. I think CD 3.4.6, 7 and 8 I think are all further documents that were submitted.
But that's correct. Yeah.
What about the environmental statement addendum? Did that consider landscape and visual impact?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Yes, the environmental statement addendum, did that include any further information?
No, it didn't.
And the reason for that?
Because there wasn't anything to report. It had a short paragraph to explain why there wasn't any further information.
Yes. And then let's just go into the methodology in the environmental statement, because this seemed to be one of the principal areas of criticism from Ms. Tudor. And again, without being completely sort of tiresome about it, can you just basically take the inspectors through the process, perhaps just point them to where the documentation is?
Yeah, of course. So in CD 2.5.22, page 1 obviously is the start of the methodology. It sets out the guidance, notes and other sources of information that have informed the approach in addition to GLVI 3. It then goes on to talk at 1.1 with regard to landscape effects and how you evaluate a landscape's sensitivity to change.
And is the methodology in accordance with GLVI 3?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, that's fine. And I think, if we go to PDF page 3, we've got a table 1A.1, which looks at landscape value. And I think it's important to look at the fact that we've got a number of criteria on the left-hand side of that table that at the bottom also includes perceptual aspects. So that's dealing with the concept of tranquility and naturalness, and also light intrusion that we've been talking a lot about today. Then after you've looked at the value, you then look at the susceptibility to change. Now that's separate because value is looking at the baseline sort of situation, whereas susceptibility to change is looking at how susceptible is the landscape to the change as a result of the development. And in conclusion, those two factors combine to result in an overall sensitivity of the landscape to change. Now, in all cases, the A1B landscape character areas and the designation itself were assessed at a high level, at the highest level. And when you look at sensitivity, you then need to look at magnitude of landscape change. So at page 5, at paragraph 1.1.14, we see what the criteria for landscape change are. And I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but it culminates in the table 9.8.4, which sets out the sort of key determining criteria. And that does include characteristics such as tranquility and naturalness, that could affect the perceptual characteristics of the landscape. So it's not purely a assessment of whether elements have changed in the landscape. It does combine, it does directly refer to perceptual considerations, and I think that's important given the criticism that we've received that those factors have not been considered fully enough. We then scroll on quite quickly to look at, to make a decision on that magnitude in relation to the criteria. And I note that Ms. Tudor, in her evidence this morning, was suggesting that somehow the criteria were wrong, or they were skewed to result in effects perhaps that could have otherwise been significant. And I think it's a very straightforward explanation, is that it's a 4-category assessment of magnitude. At the highest level, you would see a large-scale change. At a medium level, you would see a medium scale of change. And a low is a small scale. It's not a complicated consideration, really. And therefore, you do have the potential to result in significant effects on high sensitivity landscapes, because when you look at the matrix, and this is the last piece of the assessment jigsaw, if you scroll a number of pages on, if you just bear with me, I will tell you the page.
PDF page 12, I think.
It is indeed, and it's at table 1A.7, so the matrix here. So for most of the, well, for all of the landscapes within the A1B, the sensitivity of the receptor has been assessed at a high level. So you can see that with the magnitude of change on the left-hand side, you'd only need to get to a low level for it to be potentially significant. So there isn't any sort of, smoke and mirrors, if you like, with the matrix. It is a fair assessment that if you're in a high sensitivity landscape and you've got a low change, that you could end up with effects that are potentially significant. So what we then did at Appendix 9B, which is page 13, is that we looked at all of the individual landscape character areas, both within the A1B and within the setting of the A1B, and then we undertook a detailed assessment of those. I don't wish to go into those in any detail, but I think if you were just to look at the first table, which is table 9B.1, you will see that there is a judgment on whether the effects are direct or not, or indirect, and then there's a recording of the key characteristics of the landscape character area, and then using the value criteria below, we've assigned a value to that component of the landscape character area, and those combine on the next page to come up with an overall value, as I was saying. Then we've looked at susceptibility in detail, both physical, visual, and perceptual, and we've made judgments on those and looked at the susceptibility. Then we've combined the two to come up with a conclusion for the overall sensitivity of that landscape character area. So that's been undertaken for all of the areas that have been scoped into the assessment. And then the following appendix, and I'll be fairly brief here. If we scroll to page
Appendix 9C.
9F.
9F.
So page 40, PDF page 41, 42. So the first table is quite relevant. because we've looked at, so the first line in that is overall landscape sensitivity. So the assessment of high sensitivity has obviously followed all of that previous assessment to come up with that level of high. We've then gone through all of the special qualities and made a judgment on whether the development would have an effect on that, not just in terms of views, but those are obviously a component of the assessment on landscape, but also an assessment of perceptual aspects as well, where that's relevant. So you see, for example, and very quickly on special quality 3, you can see that there's a commentary on the lighting, there's commentary on the tranquility levels across the study area, and these reference to both field observations that were made by the assessors, but also published baseline data that comprise the CPRE tranquility mapping and also the dark skies mapping. And we've critically evaluated those data sources because the tranquility mapping from CPRE does tend to focus on roads and settlements. So you get potentially a picture that is not completely accurate to what you would experience in the field. So if I could just refer you to...
Just, if I just get you to pause just for a moment, actually for the benefit of the inspectors, we can see in the table there on PDF page 42, you have special quality 1, special quality 2, special quality 3, and you can see there that there is that slight misalignment between the special quality numbers in the then AONB management plan and CD 532, which has tranquility as number 1, and you can see in this table tranquility is number 3.
Yes.
And views, I think, are number 2 in both of them, but is that simply a function of a slight reordering in the...
I think that's an accurate summary, yes.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to...
That's fine. So if we're able to also have a look, whilst we're on the topic of tranquility and dark skies, if we could pull up, I think it's CD 2.5.24. I'm just going to get you a PDF page. So we're looking at PDF page 31 and 32 of CD 2.5.24. So if you've got that in front of you, you can see the effect, obviously, of tranquility as assessed by CPRE. Not surprisingly, the larger settlements, Bristol, Clevedon outside the study area, have a significantly reduced, least tranquil judgment. And then you'll see to the south of the extended study area, where the caption Mendip Hills, where the AONB is, you'll see some of the most tranquil areas with the greens and some of the yellows. And I think what this this plan shows is that the roads do have quite an influence on tranquility, both the A338 and the A38, but also some of the smaller settlements have an impact as well. And then we can move on to the next figure, 9.41, which is the next page in the PDF. And again, you could not surprisingly see that the Bristol Airport site itself, in terms of lighting, is already at the sort of the highest level. I think it's quite important in the context of how you perceive that lighting from the A and B to make some reference to the baseline photo views that were undertaken from Beacon Batch and from the open access land that was further to the south. I'm just going to try and bring those up, if you just bear with me. So we're looking at figure 9.25. So we're in the same document, but we now scroll back. Apologies, I'm a bit slow.
PDF page 25, I think, in CD 2.5.23.
Yes, sorry.
CD 2.5.23, page 25, I think.
Yeah. I was hoping it might be at the start of that previous document. Just bear with me. So if you've got figure 9.25, these two views, the top view is from Burrington Ham, AUMB, which is sort of a large area of open access land, about 5 kilometres to the south of the airport. And the Beacon Batch is the high point that's is another sort of couple of kilometres further south. And I don't really want to go through there's detailed commentary on this in the assessment text, but I think what it illustrates to you is what the existing light sources are at the airport already on the top view at viewpoint 16. That obviously includes lighting for the buildings as well as more distant light sources. And those more distant light sources come into play the more elevated you become within the A1B, because you're looking over the airport towards the Severn Bridge and lighting at Bristol, which is illustrated in the viewpoint 17 below.
And what about the suggestion that the Sill Zone extension and the year-round use of what's called Cog Loop 2 might have a significant adverse effect?
I'm not, we've obviously looked at this carefully, and we don't assess that it would do. It may be perceptible, but the overall effect would be negligible for a number of reasons, really, because you would see it against the backdrop of the existing airport, also because of the mitigation measures that would be adopted to limit the lighting. That does include passive infrared, so the lighting would switch off when there weren't cars moving around, so it wouldn't be, a constant light source. And obviously other measures which I think we've already gone over, including sort of cowling to the lighting to stop the vertical light escape, and other such measures.
Thank you. Sorry, I slightly interrupted you there.
No, not at all. So I think just moving back to the appendix CD 2.5.22, where we were talking through the landscape assessment of the Mendips Hills, A and B. That table looks obviously at the special qualities in quite a lot of detail, and if you scroll to page 43, the second page, you'll see that it's split into separate paragraphs. So there's a whole paragraph really on tranquility. It's looking at the details of the aircraft movements over the A1B. And it's also looking in the following paragraph with regard to the traffic journeys. And obviously concluding that the increase would be sort of less than 5%, and that's, this is what's informing the judgments on the magnitude of what the effect is. So we're not making, there's always some element of qualitative or subjective assessment in LVIA, but as far as possible we try to refer to objective data when we make our assessment conclusions. So scroll into the end of that, you can see that for most of the special qualities, there wouldn't be any potential for any effects. I don't need to go into that because we're focusing where the effects will be. And then following that, there were detailed assessments on all the remaining landscape character areas that have been scoped into the assessment with a similar structure of detailed assessment that takes into account perceptual characteristics as well as any sort of physical changes, which will obviously be more applicable to the host LCA.
Mr. Purban, what about the point that some LCAs have been scoped in and some have been scoped out, and whether or not the setting of the AONB has been considered?
Well, the setting definitely has been considered, and reference has been made specifically to the setting in relation to landscape character areas in terms of their selection. The two areas that were mentioned by Ms. Tudor that she considers should have been scoped in. There's detailed justification at, I think we've touched on this already, at Appendix 9E, and I don't intend to go to it now, but there is detailed justification why those areas are scoped out. It is not purely because of a lack of intervisibility, although evidently the fact that the visibility is concentrated around the plateau, there's a dip in the valley, and then you're back up to the AONB. There is a tranche of landscape that includes those areas that are outside or predominantly outside the ZTVs. So that's one factor. But the other factor that was considered in scoping in and out was related to, well, what was the baseline tranquility? You know, if the baseline tranquility was already affected by sort of the A38 and other roads plus settlements, then the susceptibility or the chance that there would be a significant effect is much more reduced. So we're not purely doing assessment for assessment's sake. We're doing assessment to predict or where there's a likelihood or a reasonable chance of a significant effect.
And then you've taken us through the assessment and the consideration against the special qualities. You've pointed us to where the other character areas are considered. Before we get to just briefly touch on cumulative effects, are there any other points, any other parts of the assessment you want to take the inspectors to?
No, I think that's probably sufficient for now.
So then the point that is made by Ms. Tudor about cumulative effect and having to consider the development with, you know, potential future growth to 20 mppa. You know, what in broad terms is your view on all of that?
I mean, I don't think that's the right approach. You assess what's in front of you. If there's an application, a plan application that's to be determined and it's in the system, then, and it's got the potential for a significant cumulative effect at that point in time, then it can be scoped in, and this is all agreed with the local authorities. It's normally a cut-off date where you kind of incorporate those assessments. I mean, would be subject to a separate planning application and different considerations, because the cumulative baseline is always changing. You have to have a point where you do assess it, and you know, we have done that. we've assessed the Banwell Garden Village and the Churchill Garden Village within Chapter 18 of the ES, and we concluded that in relation to Churchill Garden Village that there wasn't any cumulative effect because of intervening woodland and planting. And with respect to SD3, which was Banwell Garden Village, that's much more distant, so there wasn't any potential. So it's a question really of scoping cumulative for every environmental discipline in a different way. So you're looking at where there's a realistic potential for any significant effects. And as we've noted already, the JSP was withdrawn in any event, but we did undertake that detailed assessment of cumulative effects.
And your overall conclusion of the significance of effect?
Well, from the AOMB and from the component landscape character areas, we've assessed it to be minor adverse as a result of a negligible magnitude of change on the high sensitivity receptor. So there's a clear rationale there that flows through these appendices to come to that conclusion.
Thank you very much. Stay there. Be some questions. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much. Over to you, Mr. Excuse me. Microphone. Mike.
That one.
Is that better? Yes, I have some questions. I just wanted to go back, perhaps just leave this magnitude of change thing, just a couple of questions on that and then just put it to bed because it's possibly been done to death. But I want to look at, oh my goodness, where is this? It is in the addendum, I think you're calling it, the methodology and the environmental statement.
Appendix.
Yes, it is 2.5.6. We were looking at it this morning.
Oh, 5.6.
I'll have to check that again.
Is this the Chapter 4 approach or the...
I'm looking at table 4.1 in it. Actually, it's not a huge document, so I can just run to the top of it.
This is
Approach to
chapter
preparing the environmental statement.
So which table? Are we looking at the matrix?
Yes, it's the matrix in it. Table 4.1, significance
Yes, I've got
evaluation
that, yes,
matrix,
yes.
right. So the sensitivity importance value there's one called very high.
Yes.
Now in your tables in the LVIA, or that you're supporting if you didn't write, you stop at high.
Yes.
So that would mean that, for example, if you had graded the AOMB, which is a nationally protected landscape, as a very high sensitivity, it would be significant even if the magnitude of change was low.
Is it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, because when you have a moderate effect, you make a judgment about whether it's significant or not. And I think GLVO3 is certainly GLVA2 had more categories, but they're trying to move away from those categories. And I think in any event, it's highly unlikely that we would have, even if there was an additional category, that we would have assessed the A1B at a very high level, because there's already impacts on on tranquility from the existing airport and from other factors in the landscape.
So the fact that there's existing impact from the airport means that you assess the sensitivity slightly lower than you might otherwise have done.
Well, because sensitivity is comprised of susceptibility and value. So value would always be, you know, at the high level, but the susceptibility, you have to take into account what, you know, what the development is that you are proposing and, you know, how susceptible is a landscape. So, you know, for example, putting a airport on Dartmoor, where there's no other, you know, presumably no other development, no other airports, is going to be more susceptible than slightly increasing some flights to an existing airport. So you can't say that every AONB is at the highest possible level. It needs to reflect that susceptibility.
Okay, and so then the criteria for defining magnitude of change, being loss of landscape, etc., would mean that in this assessment you've mostly come down to low, possibly medium occasionally, and that means that the only, if we're looking at this matrix on table 4.1, that means a lot of things are not going to be significant because you're not accepting this much magnitude of change and you're not using the very high sensitivity.
Well, because the magnitude of change is what it is, you know, it's defined the categories. And I think that, you know, the matrix is fair, both versions of the matrix, this one and the one that we adopted in the LVIA. If you look where medium is and you've got a sort of a diagonal series of blue squares that say moderate, you know, potentially or probably significant, that's the same in both. So it's your judgment of magnitude. You know, if there isn't a significant change to the baseline, or if there's not a substantial change to the baseline situation, then you're not going to reach a magnitude that's going to result in significant effects. Otherwise, anything that changed would be significant.
Okay, well, I think everyone's going to be pleased that I've got no further questions on matrix and magnitude of change. So, do you accept that the setting of an AOB is a material consideration where this airport proposal is concerned?
Yes, it is, and we've assessed that.
Yeah, okay. And would you agree that the landscape character of the land adjoining the AONB is complementary to the AONB at that junction?
I think it varies quite a bit. I think it depends on the local circumstances. I certainly think that some of the land uses that are perhaps towards the sort of southeast of the study area, sort of around the sort of Upper Chew and Yeo valleys and those sort of areas, which coincidentally are not really within the ZTV of the proposal. But those are the sort of more tranquil areas that have probably got more importance to the setting than perhaps some of the areas that are more affected by settlements or major roads. So I think it's difficult to make a generalisation, but I think we've attempted to reflect in our assessment the setting through the detailed consideration of landscape character areas.
Okay, so you sort of, to summarise, you think it's sort of complicated, really?
Well, it has to be looked at in detail, and that's what we've done. You can't make simple, broad brush conclusions. You have to look at things very, very carefully. I mean, some AONBs, there's many examples across the country, and I won't bore you with all the details, but there were some that are, are degraded because of direct impacts. Sometimes it could be, because of mining or whatever. Other areas, there might be an indirect influence because of major road corridors. So you can't give a blanket sensitivity across a landscape or its setting. It's got to be looked at in a lot of detail, which is what we did in the environmental statement. Okay.
So you mentioned it's been raised that a couple of areas were scoped out, and as I understand it, you referred back to your figure with the zone of theoretical visibility, and that this was a reason for scoping out J2, and perhaps to an extent Area 3 as well. I don't know if you've It's a very basic diagram, but it certainly helped me understand the one we circulated this morning. Do you have a copy of that?
Yes, on...
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, would you accept that a zone of theoretical visibility deals with visibility, but it doesn't deal with noise impact?
No, it doesn't, but I think, as I said earlier, when we've looked at the considerations for scoping out these areas, it hasn't been based solely on visibility, it's been based on tranquility impacts as well, particularly for J2. And I think, you know, whilst we're on the subject, it might be just worth bringing up that that appendix. So it's CD 2.5.22. And we're looking at Appendix 9.
What page is that?
Sorry, I'm just trying to find it, if you just bear with me. So we're looking at page 40.
This is where I find out if I've got the right. Okay.
So under J2, which is about halfway down the page, it's, I'll just paraphrase the gist of it, but basically it just says it's a large LCA that covers the southwestern part of the study area, and because it's low in ground elevation, most of it's outside the ZTV, and then it also goes on to say that tranquility is influenced by the large settlements, plus a long section of the A38. So those two factors in combination reduce its sensitivity to potential impacts. That's not saying that there won't be any impacts, it's just saying that the likelihood that they're significant, there just isn't any
I think you were here this morning when we raised the diagram in Mr. Fiumicelli's evidence showing aircraft overflying at less than 7,000 feet.
Yeah.
So would that not have been, does that not, and the fact that the J2 description refers to aircraft noise, would, in fact this goes to the size of your site as well, would it not have been more appropriate to look at that low-flying aircraft impact to determine the size and the shape of the area you were assessing, and also to look at, to scope an area out entirely where it's getting a lot of aircraft impact and is going to get more? Is that appropriate?
I think it is, because we've assessed the host area with what the airport's located in and not concluded any significant effects. And we've assessed areas that are of higher sensitivity because of their inherent value, such as the LCAs in the AOMB, and we've also concluded there wouldn't be a significant effect. So there has to come a proportion, you know, LVIA is about proportionality and about identifying significant effects. So at some point you have to look at this and come to a conclusion that's logical and is informative to, you know, whether there will be any significant effects or not. And we just don't believe, based on that analysis, but also based on the subsequent analysis of the areas close to the airport and higher sensitivity areas on the A1B further away, that there would be any justification for scoping in J2.
So there's an awful lot of diagrams in the environmental statement and in all the documentation. Did you ever produce something equivalent to the zone of theoretical visibility that looked at the flight paths below 7,000 feet? I can't see that diagram anywhere in your
because we didn't do that, because when it's explained within the environmental statement, if you just bear with you, I'm just looking for the reference where it is explained why we didn't do that. might need to come back to that. Oh, no, sorry, here we are. So this is at the LVIA, Chapter 9. So we're looking at CD 2.5.21. And then we're looking at PDF page 7. And we're looking at the last bullet point at the end of that page. And again, I'll just sort of briefly paraphrase from that paragraph. So it's basically saying modelling aircraft in the air would, at whatever height, is going to result in the whole study area being in the ZTV, so it's not really going to aid any assessment. You need to make a judgment on the basis of what the existing tranquility is and whether an area should be scoped in or not. And the same principles apply for aircraft moving along the runway. This is all about having some knowledge and having some insight about whether the changes are likely to result in significant effects. So the two.
Okay, but can you see there's a bit of there's a predetermination here. If you don't look at the evidence.
Well, we do. That's the whole point of scoping and providing the justification in the Appendix 9E of why we have scoped out the landscape character areas. And it's not based on, as I said, it's not purely based on ZTV, it's based on assessment of tranquility, but also on outline assessment of other areas. Because, there's got to be a point where
I understand what
you have
you're
to
saying.
stop the assessment, otherwise it becomes disproportionate, and it has to be informative to identify significant effects. That's the purpose of it. It's not to identify every effect, it's to identify those that are likely to be significant.
Yes, but once you scope something out, it isn't going to be assessed. You haven't looked at the flights. Oh, can I just finish, please?
Yeah.
You haven't looked at the flights over 7,000 feet, and you have, with the case of J2 and 3, you have landscape character area descriptions which mention aircraft noise as an issue.
Yeah, but on the basis that the host area doesn't sustain significant effects and the AOMB doesn't, there isn't any justification for scoping them in, because you would just produce pages of assessment and it would just say the same thing. And I think that that's why there is a scoping process to allow these documents to be concise. I mean, I'm sure many people think that this LVIA isn't concise, but it would be, even more indigestible if we put in every single area that was in the study area.
Okay, so moving on slightly, just to stay with the paragraph you took us to, page 7 on the LVIA proper, 2.5.21, paragraph 9.4.10, the reasons for not modelling aircraft and not dealing with the numbers of flights under 7,000 feet. You took us down to the last bullet point. Now that talks about the visual effects of the aircraft. It doesn't talk about the noise impacts, does it?
No, it doesn't, but I think the same thing applies, that if you've scoped in the area that's the host area and you have considered noise, which we did in that assessment, and you've covered higher sensitivity areas that are slightly further away within the AOMB, and you've considered noise in detail, then I don't see that there's any justification for including the areas that were omitted.
So you are sort of saying then that the airport is already impacting adversely on the tranquility special quality of the AOMB?
Well, I think that's evident from the documentation, and there's no, there's no sort of denial within the LVIA that there would be some minor adverse effects as a result of the proposed development, but we don't consider those to be at a significant level, and neither did the local authority.
Okay, so you've answered my next question. My question was about the current situation, is that the airport is already adversely impacting the tranquility, special quality of the AONB.
But it's there, it's not going to suddenly go away. So
No, but
this is
that's
the
not
baseline.
answering my question.
Well, yes, it is. It does, but that's part of the existing baseline that you have to take into account.
Yeah, I mean, if we just go to your rebuttal proof, para 2.1.1, you state in that the sight and sounds of flights from the AONB is already long established, and that the 11% extra flights will have no more than a moderate impact. That's correct, I think, isn't it?
2.1.
It's at the bottom of that paragraph, that's 2.1.1, it's the third paragraph.
Yeah,
of your
this is a
rebuttal.
quote from the planning officer's report, isn't it?
Right. And you'd agree with that, would you?
No, I think that moderate isn't the right description because we've assessed it as minor, but that's their opinion. That they still don't assess that it's significant.
Although if we had a higher sensitivity, it might be.
I don't think so.
Okay, but there is a slight difference of opinion there.
Well, evidently, though, you know, I don't think you can read too much into that because they say likely to be no more than moderate. It doesn't say that it isn't minor. It doesn't really make any conclusion on significance either.
Okay. So BAL is very proud of the rate of growth at the airport, and over the last 20 or so years, the number of flights from the airport has increased very significantly. Would you agree with that?
I'm not really party to the sort of full planning history and how the airports expand. My understanding is that there's been growth, yes.
So, yeah, the word incremental growth has gotten used quite a bit. Would you agree that there's been incremental growth in the impact on the tranquility of the AONB over the years as well?
I couldn't comment because I don't know the relative contribution of the airport versus other types of development that would have contributed. So, for example, when I undertook my own field assessments, the greatest noise that I could perceive from the AONB at a particular point in time, so I think we need to be careful not to draw too many hard conclusions from this, was traffic noise. But we don't know why that traffic's increasing. Is it just, you know, there would be some contribution from the airport, but there would be lots of other reasons why traffic's increasing and having an impact on the tranquility of the A1B. So I wouldn't want to jump to conclusions and say, you know, the impact is on that small part of the AONB that's within the study area, not forgetting the overall size of the designation, would be solely down to the growth of the airport. You know, it's going to have a contribution, but it's not for me to judge historically what that was.
But your baseline has assessed that due to a certain erosion of tranquility, you're using a high sensibility of the AONB landscape, but not a very high.
But
You
no,
said that back then about the matrix.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we look at this incremental growth and the impact on the tranquility of the AONB, will there not come a point where this incremental growth becomes unacceptable in terms of its impact on the AONB?
Possibly, but that isn't the subject of this application, and we don't know a lot of things about what might happen in the future. For example, you know, plane fuel, plane engines are changing. You know, it's just hypothetical. So I don't think it's relevant to this application to be making sort of consideration of that.
Okay, so your proof has referred to work by Bickerdike Allen and shows in, well, stay with your table 1, that there would be 13 extra flights over the Mendips a day, Mendip AONB.
Yeah.
And in passing, I would say that 13 extra on 81 for me is more like 16% than 11.
I'm not sure what the exact maths of that are the numbers and the percentages, I think, are related to direct quotes from their report. It's certainly not numbers that we've
No, but
plucked out of the air.
11% has been mentioned, but if you look at that table,
It could possibly be because you're looking at day. Is it because it's looking at daytime and nighttime? I'm not too sure. I don't know.
The difference, I don't think, I might be wrong, I don't think the 11% was mentioned today. That might be overall numbers, but this is talking about numbers of aircraft that were coming in on a particular route, so the percentage might be different. I'm speculating on that, but that might be why it's different from the overall percentage.
different and higher then. Sorry, I'm not quite sure who I'm addressing my questions to.
Well, no, I think I think the yardstick that we took was that it would be approximately an extra flight per hour. And I think you need to have experienced what you know, or done a field assessment to understand really what that would mean. And it does relate to sort of how long people are in the A1B, and you know what they're doing while they're there. Are they moving, or are they just going to be sitting in one spot for several hours? You know, it does depend. How I think Miss Jude mentioned this morning about people's sensitivity to these things varies as well. So I don't think there's a hard and fast answer about, you know, when does it become too much. But the fact is that they're flying at height over the A1B. When there's low cloud, you can't see the planes. When there's clear skies, you can see them, but they're very, very distant because they're not, you know, they're not passing over Beacon Batch at sort of a low level.
Well, quite a lot of them are flying at below 7,000 foot if you look at Mr. Fumicelli's evidence.
Yeah, but just from my own field experience, and I've been there 3 times and looked at and tried to understand what the impact was, and I don't, personally, my experience was that there wasn't low-flying aircraft.
Your experience was during the pandemic, I believe.
No, it was this week.
Yeah, and aircraft movements are still incredibly restricted.
Well, I went at the peak time because I went at lunchtime on 2 occasions just to experience it. So I didn't, you know, I felt I had to do that to be confident on what the conclusions were, because as you said, I did visit the site back in April when it was a pandemic and there was nothing moving at all. So I needed to experience, you know, myself to be confident on the assessment that was undertaken, which I am.
Okay, you go on to quote the Bickett-Dyke-Allen report as stating that the extra noise from these aircraft will average out at less than 1 decibel over the day, and so is not significant. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not a noise expert, but I do know that the noise from a low-flying aircraft is not evened out nicely over the day. It's a point source of noise and a stress for a short period of time.
Sorry, are you reading,
This is just me.
giving evidence?
Background information before my question. It's about how appropriate it was to quote the noise impact of an aircraft to even it out over the whole day, particularly when tranquility rather than overall noise impact is being considered. So my question to you is it really relevant to, when you're considering tranquility, to even out the noise impact over the whole day when what's actually happening is the stress of a relatively quick event?
I think there are parameters that were quoted by the noise consultants. I think that's probably why we did talk about the extra flight per hour, which is the point source. So I think we've tried to use the 2 parameters to give an impression of what the impact would be.
Okay. I had some questions about direct, indirect. I think we'll leave that. We've dealt with that enough. Just a final question, really, on traffic noise. You mentioned that you found it particularly, you sort of felt that that was perhaps the greatest noise at the moment.
It varies according to weather, because I went on a very cloudy day, which I think was Tuesday, and then it was very sunny on Wednesday, and the noise profiles were completely different between the different sources, whether it was the aircraft or the traffic. So I think it's fair to say wind direction, there's lots of different factors that are going to play into what you experience, experience the impact as from a tranquility point of view.
Yeah. So traffic on the more minor lanes, leaving the A38 aside, which is obviously not tranquil, but the country lanes, there is, I think you'd say it's about 5% extra traffic. My question is, do you accept that the impact of traffic in a rural area is not just about noise? There is a slight threat from traffic, there is a certain visual impact, there are other impacts besides noise of traffic on small rural lanes.
Yeah, I think that with respect to the increases in traffic, I think the first point to make is that the A roads, when you view them from the A and B, are down in the valley and they're quite distant. And in fact, from some points, I certainly looked from the open access land at Burrington Ham, and I was trying to sort of get a view down into the valley because you could hear the traffic noise, but you couldn't see the traffic. So it's very much sort of going back to my earlier answer. You can't generalise because it will have different impacts in different areas of the A and B. But I certainly didn't find in any of the locations that I visited within the AOMB on any of the viewpoints that traffic was visually intrusive. Your point about the use on minor roads, obviously if there were people that will cut through if there's an accident on the A road or whatever, I don't believe that, just from a common sense perspective, that the increase of 5% is going to necessarily be across the board. Surely it would be concentrated more on the A roads because people are trying to get from wherever they live to the airport. Occasionally there might be cut-throughs, but I can't imagine that it would be at the upper end of that 5%.
There are quite a few established rat runs actually on the minor roads. But my point is that if you're using the A and B for recreational purposes, and maybe you're on footpaths but coming onto lanes, that increased traffic isn't just a noise issue, it's an extra danger, it's an extra inconvenience. It means that you may not walk on a lane that you might otherwise have walked on. Do you accept that there are other... So my original question was...
I accept that as a principle, but I don't think that it's a realistic or significant issue in respect to the airport, given the separation distance and the amount of increase that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you very much. Any re-examination, Mr. Humphreys?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay. Right, thank you all very much indeed. We will adjourn now until Tuesday, I don't know what the date is, sorry, Tuesday week anyway, whenever that is. Tuesday week at 9:30. And for those of us who are having a holiday next week, have a good break. And for the rest of you, have a nice time anyway. Okay. Yes, just keep going. Okay, thank you all very much. I'll see you on Tuesday week, 28th.